I've brought a little footstool to stand on. I'm not really as tall as this, but it makes me much more comfortable, and I'm closer to the mic, so I think if you can all hear me, I will start by, first of all, thanking Harriet for looking after me so well, and Cheryl also in Susanna's absence. And I actually want to thank all of you. I don't know how many of you might have been here 7 years ago, almost to the day, June 2015, when I gave my first Jane Austen talk. It was called Rereading Jane Austen, and it was at a time when I was just on the brink of trying to decide whether or not I would undertake at quite an advanced age something that had always been an ambition. I had always wanted to do the sort of research that goes into a doctoral dissertation. And in Jane Austen and the enthusiastic reception that we received that day, the very intelligent questions that were asked, I felt that I was onto something that I had the confidence to go on with. So in fact, JASA itself is really the recipient of a lot of my thanks today. But those thanks having been given, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we meet on today to share this long overdue story of a thesis. As for the story, well, it happened like this. When I decided to embark on a rereading of Austen's major works, the 6 radiant novels, as they were called by the American novelist Eudora Welty, my curiosity was ignited in an unexpected way. My intention had been simply to experience again the pleasure of Austen's fiction. But as I reread the novels, I found myself reflecting on how profoundly my own best view of life, my own love of language and literature, had been influenced by the Austen novels, just the 6 of them that I had read over my lifetime. And that curiosity was further stirred by an interest that appeared in public discourse and a lot of newspaper articles. I don't know also whether you remember at that time, Simon Birmingham had become the Minister for Education. And one of the first articles that was written about him, apart from the importance of innovation and enterprise, was the one in which he discussed how bored he had been by reading Pride and Prejudice at school. Well, that was another one of the challenges that really made me feel that I wanted to ask some questions. I really wanted to try to understand what value young people might get in the 21st century in their classrooms by reading Jane Austen's novels. Was it possible, I wondered, for contemporary young readers to derive the sort of pleasure and wisdom from Austen's novels that I felt I had derived from her fictional universe, particularly as they live in a society which is so different from the society in which Jane Austen wrote and the society in which I myself spent my youth. More choices, less certainty, and vastly different technologies, and that's just a start. My rereadings persuaded me that despite the passage of time, such relationships and conflicts are represented so authentically in Austen's fiction that they transcend both place and time. Any doubt I might have had was mediated by my belief that really literature is about life, and that the fundamental concerns of society in normal times have remained the same over my lifetime. Relationships between people at all levels of society and at different stages of intimacy, the relationship between money and morality, and conflicts between self-interest and the needs of others. What I needed to understand, I thought, was how students approach novels like Austen's in their English classes. Especially, I wanted to understand whether the shifting tide of literary and cultural thought that has encouraged the interrogation of texts might inhibit their engagement with Austen's central themes. I also wondered whether my own lived experience of reading Austen's fiction, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, or Emma, for example, could shed light on how the novels might continue to engage young readers in ways that are both pleasant and practical. My reflections started to take shape. They became more focused, and they gradually developed into a systematic investigation of the potential value of reading Austen's novels in contemporary classrooms. In my talk today, I'm hoping to convey a sense of the process as well as the evolving argument about reading fiction, and also what I believe is the significance of my thesis. And that brings me to my title slide. What is the point, you might be asking, of placing a mortarboard on Jane Austen's head? Well, first of all, Cheryl was clever enough to do it at my request. But second, the answer that I'm going to give you is both playful and serious. On the one hand, the author's education was probably limited to what she picked up from her Oxford-educated father and older brothers, and from her own reading. Actually, I think she herself would have laughed at the idea of appearing in academic dress. But in another way, the tribute is serious, and I think it's really well-deserved. Austen produced a relatively slender body of fiction, some published in her lifetime and some more recently. But her writing has inspired a huge volume of writing about her life, her times and her work. Austen Studies, as that is called, includes hundreds, perhaps thousands, of doctoral dissertations. Surely that demands serious acknowledgement. For 2 centuries, Austen's readers have been intrigued by the uniqueness of her language, her narratives, and her status in both high and popular culture. An enduring spirit of curiosity has motivated Austen scholars and readers to undertake research that will, it is always hoped, shed a slightly different light on what makes her a literary legend. So I hope you'll agree with me that if the cap fits, she ought, and that is one of her favourite words, she really ought to wear it, even if it's just for today. On this slide, you will see a short list of recent titles, thesis titles, that illustrate a few of the perspectives from which Austen's novels have been investigated just in the past 5 years. The first thesis includes what is called a creative artefact, but it's actually a very short novel called Love Tokens, and it explores the possibility that the sister Cassandra Austen contributed to some of Austen's writings. It is my favourite. I really like that whole idea, and the novel is accompanied by a commentary that tells the story of the research and the thinking that went into the writing. The second thesis considers how Austen adaptations bring renewed life and interest to familiar plots, characters, and themes. The third posits that Austen represents different and recognisable types of couples in the novels, from an ideal couple, like Elizabeth and Darcy, to a pragmatic couple, like Charlotte Lucas and Mr. Collins. And the final example focuses on the controversial pairing in Austen's fiction of virtue and Christian love. Originally, I thought of my dissertation simply as a Jane Austen thesis, but it is probably more accurate to describe it as an inquiry into how Jane Austen's fiction might best be read at school to justify, or perhaps to just explain, not only its enduring presence on the literature syllabus, but also precisely why it is considered relevant to young people. In New South Wales, students have had the option of reading one of Austen's novels ever since the first senior secondary school syllabus was inscribed in 1911. In making my investigation, I had in mind those higher school certificate students in New South Wales schools whose teachers happened to select a novel written by Jane Austen for an HSC syllabus module, which is called The Critical Study of Literature. How might or even should they read the novels, I asked myself, to fulfil the curriculum expectation of all content, to develop practical life skills and to be a preparation for adulthood, to fulfil syllabus outcomes that demonstrate that students can perform sophisticated critical analysis. And there's also a wider goal, a wider educational goal. How could they read Jane Austen's novels so that they themselves could experience the joys of reading? These were the questions that I wanted to answer. The thesis proposal I presented in 216 had the provisional title, Reading Jane Austen, Lessons in Empathy. That is because it drew together two areas of interest that had been occupying my thoughts since retiring from classroom teaching. The first stemmed from my desire to understand how we read for pleasure and why, in my own very pleasurable reading life, Jane Austen's novels had influenced so significantly my beliefs, attitudes, and possibly my behaviour. Another motivation was a result of one of those light bulb moments which I had when I was supervising a school intergenerational oral history project. I was struck by how the relationships that developed between students and the people they were interviewing became increasingly empathetic as the project progressed, and how empathy appeared to generate an exceptionally high level of motivation to learn, to research, to create and to produce. It was a small step from this observation to further speculations about how empathy might be harnessed to teaching in the classroom as a way of connecting students with people and ideas as a key to learning in its own right. It was in thinking about empathy that I connected my own experience of reading Jane Austen's novels, again, with the possibilities of how they might be read today. I recall that from the moment I first read Pride and Prejudice at school, my way of thinking about books and reading changed. And at this later time, I grasped that my relationship with Austen, the narrator, was deeply empathetic, something I would not have thought of at the time. That this relationship had been shared by other readers is obvious from the many outpourings of pleasure about Jane Austen herself, although some of them are excessive. The Prime Minister Disraeli, for example, said that he had read Pride and Prejudice 17 times, and Robert Louis Stephens said that every time he read Pride and Prejudice, he wanted to get down on one knee and propose, not to Jane Austen, but to Elizabeth Bennet. So it did strike me that this sort of personal relationship between a book's writer and its readers might be a key to reading enjoyment. I suspected, however, that this aspect of reading is not encouraged by the way students learn to read for examination purposes. Perhaps I thought I could find a better way, and I suppose that really was the beginning. George Pellew's Harvard Prize dissertation, published in 1883, might have been the very first Austen dissertation. Pellew sent his study to Henry James, and the master, as he has been called, sometimes tongue-in-cheek, began his response, as you can see. I found your thin red book on my table when I came in last night. It is interesting as an attempt in scientific criticism of the delightful Jane, though as I read the first page or two, I tremble lest you should overdo the science. How very Henry James that is. Pellew's monograph is possibly the first attempt to sketch the literary tradition in which Austen's novels are located. Henry James, as you can see, was sceptical of the application of scientific criticism to Austen. James's scepticism about the seriousness of Austen's literary accomplishments is a fascinating story in Austen studies, but it is a story for another time. My own dissertation is just one in the long scholarly line that has followed in George Pelew's footsteps. Louise Gluck, a poet who was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2020, maintains that scholarship goes beyond opinions and beliefs. It is driven by a taste for research, combined with an inclination for meditation. She describes her own method as writing from what she knows and at the same time undermining what she knows with intelligent questions. It seems to me that in this description, Gluck quite inadvertently captures something that distinguishes Austen's literary method and gives it that subtle transgressive undercurrent that Henry James failed to notice in his delightful Jane. Like Gluck, Jane Austen created masterpieces by applying intelligent questions to what she observed in the world around her. And in this respect, I wished to emulate both Gluck and Austen in my own scholarship. I had been working to develop my 10,000-word proposal into a thesis for 3 years when it became obvious that the original title, let me remind you, Reading Jane Austen, Lessons in Empathy, was not working. And neither was the chosen research method. My supervisor had suggested that my topic was a good fit for her field of expertise, historical curriculum analysis, and that Jane Austen's fiction might serve as a case to illustrate how literature teaching and learning were conceptualised in the most recent English syllabus. Accordingly, I had spent 3 years conducting a survey of literary study and the changing conceptualisation of literature in the New South Wales school curriculum from 1911, the first one, until the most recent 2017 at that time. But I was floundering to make the transition from the historical analysis of literary study to Austen's fiction and the role of empathy, which had been preempted in the original title. To cut a long story short, at this stage my primary supervisor and I parted company. With the support of my auxiliary supervisor, who was an Austen scholar, I transferred departments from education to English and to a new primary supervisor with a humanistic approach to both literature and research. She suggested that I examine and emulate the style of the reading memoir genre in presenting my case. So the title of the thesis changed to the one you see here, Milestones in a Reading Life, Jane Austen and Lessons in Reading, Learning and the Imagination. My replacement supervisor gave me license, indeed she encouraged me, to weave a personal strand about my lived Austen reading experiences through the critical approaches that are mandated in the syllabus module. In developing this pattern, I also developed a way of thinking and writing about Jane Austen's fiction that was a better fit with the way my mind works. It was a more humanities-based reading pedagogy that embraces, rather than gestures, to a type of reading, a theory of reading which is called reading response. This is a method of reading which affirms the role of readers as well as writers in the making of meaning. The focus shifted too. Instead of conducting an analysis of the way literary study is conceptualised in its syllabus, I undertook a contemporary reappraisal of 3 of Austen's novels. This provided me with data to address a neglected nexus or conjunction in the English classroom, the relationship between reading fiction and reading pedagogy. 8 months later, the thesis was ready to submit. The curriculum research I had already done was not wasted. It served as an appendix, but now it was a backdrop rather than a framework to the study, and the historical survey became a resource for tracing the nature and trajectory of theories about literature and reading over that period of time. There is by default quite a lot of theory about learning, language, literature, and the imagination. In the thesis, I cite and review current research to provide evidence that young people who take pleasure in their reading experiences show enhanced states of well-being and also perform better across the curriculum, even those born into the age of the internet. I explore the theories of the moral philosopher Martha Nussbaum, who argues compellingly that reading literature is useful because it fosters the capabilities, practical and ethical, that we need as participants in a democratic society. And I note in the thesis that these capabilities are congruent with some of those specified in the Australian national curriculum. In my first chapter, I discuss how the pleasure of my personal reading experience was accompanied by a transformation at various stages of my understanding of myself and others and of ideas. These stages are something like the zones of proximal development suggested by the language theorist Les Vygotsky. Each developmental stage brings us to a resting place in our learning. Through language, our thoughts become entwined with our imagination, and we reach a state of readiness to move on to a higher order of conceptualization. Vygotsky, who is very much in fashion in curriculum and English teaching theory at the moment, sets great store on social interaction in this process. But I believe that I arrived at such a place myself when at the age of 7 I journeyed through the language of Lewis Carroll's Wonderland, accompanied by the characters, and gradually came to know and sometimes understand Alice, her eccentric friends, and their weird adventures. I never lost the sensation of pleasure and excitement of that initiation into the realm of imaginative fiction, nor did I lose the feeling that I was on the brink of understanding something that might be even more significant than the words and sentences I was reading, thoughts the like of which I had never before entertained. Just as a thesis requires a theoretical framework, so it must be bounded by a conceptual framework, an idea or set of ideas to which the hypothesis and the developing argument relate. For my conceptual framework, I appropriated Horace, the Latin poet, who in his celebrated Ars Poetica describes the sweetness, in Latin dolce, and the usefulness, utile, of poetry. I conceptualize literature accordingly as a potential source of both pleasure or sweetness and practical wisdom or usefulness. My own reading experience and the experiences recorded in a number of reading memoirs serve the argument of the thesis by illustrating how teaching and delighting can become entwined as we read. The analysis of 3 of Austen's novels, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, and Emma, makes up the body of the thesis. The claim to originality, essential to a doctoral thesis, rests on the development of an approach to reading that blends the lived experience of reading with traditional approaches to studying literature. Close and attentive reading of the text, making sense of the relevant critical scholarship, and an account of the literary and cultural discourses that reflect the way fiction, in this case Austen's fiction, has been read and taught over time. This brings me right to the heart of the thesis. From now on, I'll be quoting from my appraisal of the 3 selected novels, starting, of course, with Pride and Prejudice. At all times I endeavour to follow the example of James Wood, a literary critic who claims that only in the act of what he calls serious noticing can readers discover what is at stake in any given passage, and so ultimately in the work itself. This sort of attention, Wood claims, and I agree, has an ethical dimension related to care and caring. It's an approach to reading, I suggest in the thesis, that offers a template for learning to read and to profit from reading rich, complex, and sometimes perplexing novels at school. Now I'm going to read you a short paragraph very early in my appraisal of Pride and Prejudice in the thesis. It's written in a style that establishes that distinctively personal writing mode. My film-addicted parents had a passion for the film stars Greer Garson and Laurence Olivier. So together we watched the film Pride and Prejudice twice. I doubt that they, my parents, could have guessed my thoughts as I considered whether my mother wasn't just a little like Mrs. Bennet, and my father, well, one could only wonder at how fictional characters could be so familiar. I wondered too how my parents perceived me in their minds. If they imagined me as any of the 5 daughters, I would have liked it to be Lizzie or even perhaps Jane. Although neither was likely, I really hoped it wasn't Mary. The passage records the powerful impact that Jane Austen had on me personally when aged 15 I viewed the film, the film of the novel with my parents. Devoney Looser, who wrote The Making of Jane Austen, was one of my thesis examiners, and she commented that this personal anecdote is further evidence of the common misperception that the film before the book is a new phenomenon. She believes that many Austen readers came of age with Greer Garson as I did, just as a later and very different generation of readers have come of age with Colin Firth. In the thesis, I recall my first reading of the novel after I talked in class about the ways in which I thought that Elizabeth Bennet in the film resembles Rosalind in Shakespeare's romantic comedy As You Like It, the play we were then reading in class. And this is another passage from the thesis. I can feel again the push and pull of feelings and thoughts. On the one hand, I wanted to linger as I was reading, to ponder and savour the experience of reading, the pleasure of the language, style, and the inferences to be drawn from the words on the page. But then again, I wanted to speed up my reading, to fly through the pages to the happy ending that I knew was waiting for Elizabeth Bennet at the church door. I lived in an age when every film and popular magazine story touted marriage as the happily ever after ideal for their heroines. Besides, I had already met Rosalind in As You Like It. I had been introduced to her by one of those never-to-be-forgotten teachers that students are sometimes fortunate enough to encounter. And I knew Beatrice and Much Ado About Nothing as well from a dialogue with Benedict that I had prepared for an elocution examination. From their exploits, I understood at that stage of my development that wedding to be the end of a quest rather than, as a novelist critic Hilary Mantel warns later, and I was to discover myself the beginning of a new test. This passage serves to illustrate a reading approach to the novel Pride and Prejudice that is personal. For example, my relationships with a teacher, with learning elocution. It is cultural because it talks about marriage as an institution, and it is literary because it really gives, it conveys the strength and the power of intertextual relationships between different texts. Now we go on to Mansfield Park. When I first read Mansfield Park at university, it proved to be an auspicious choice. I think I discovered things about myself that surprised and perhaps disappointed me, but they helped me to understand who I was in that moment of my life and provided me with one of several profoundly ethical experiences encountered while reading and rereading Austen's novels. But for the purpose of this talk, I have chosen to focus on illustrating how that reading response theory that I mentioned before, how it actually works, how prior lived experience can lead a reader into a powerful connection with a work of fiction. In the thesis, I wrote, "I cannot argue that readers should like Fanny Price, but I wish they would. I want them to acknowledge the unfairness of Tom Bertram's nickname Creepmouse for his younger cousin. I also want them to understand those aspects of her nature with which I connected when I first read about the little girl who performed her long journey in safety from Portsmouth to Mansfield Park. After countless readings, I am still transported by her ordeal to a soft summer's evening on the beach. My parents had taken my brother and me there for a farewell picnic before depositing us in a new temporary home. Quest Haven was the big house nearby where we were to spend the next 6 months while our parents travelled abroad. We played happily near the water. We were country children and the sea was a novelty. My brother pointed out with delight the imprint of crab claws in the damp sand. I had no sense of how our lives were about to change. The connection between Fanny, Quest Haven, and Mansfield Park might seem nebulous, but memories of that half year were strong enough to connect me as a reader with Fanny's fictional world. My brother and I, aged 5 and 3, were separated from our parents for a period of only 6 months. The circumstances were vastly different. We were well cared for and eventually reunited with our parents. But even so, those months shaped my disposition, my personality, and my relationship with my brother, to whom I clung ferociously. Quest Haven, like Mansfield Park, was a hierarchical household in which age, not class, was an inseparable barrier to social interaction. In the sprawling house, there were rooms set aside for different age groups. Toddlers like me, who were called the littles, children of my brother's age, who were called the middles, and then there were the bigs. Each age group inhabited an exclusive space. Moments with my brother, unless stolen, were few and far between. I was lonely and confused and longed for his company. I crept to the door that separated me from my brother's age group as often as I dared, just to feel his presence, but fear of punishment kept me away as often as not. Years later, reading about Fanny, my heart and mind engaged effortlessly with her yearning for her brother William and her idealisation of Edmund as a surrogate brother. No one was unkind to me at Quest Haven. The food may not have been as delectable as the gooseberry tart with which Lady Bertram attempts to comfort Fanny, but I'm sure it was appetising. Nevertheless, like Fanny, I ended many days' sorrows by sobbing myself to sleep. The appraisal of Mansfield Park demonstrates how paying serious attention to our personal responses to what is read can give interesting insights into the craft of the novel and expand and amplifying our own understanding of ourselves. One of the thesis examiners commented on the power of the felt connections to Fanny, especially in those remembered stories of the children's home in which my brother and I had spent several months. While writing my thesis, I reread and reflected on memories of previous readings of Mansfield Park. Gradually, I arrived at a different way of understanding how I had become attached to both the novel and the fictional heroine. My new insights were clarified and affirmed by the work of the literary scholar Rita Felsky, who uses the concept of attachment to works of art to explain the mysterious way in which readers become hooked to particular texts, or in a broader context, to works of art in general. Felsky, and I don't know how you will feel about this, Felsky describes reading as a messy process in which we draw at will on an archive of memories about previous reading experiences, as well as personal lived experiences, to make sense of the people and circumstances that we encounter in the stories. In the thesis, I describe Felsky as the harbinger of a new surge of interest in other ways of reading. She is concerned with developing a vocabulary with which to convey the multiplicity of ways for connecting with art. She makes a case for attachment as a key word for the humanities and a core concept when examining the process and pleasure of reading across time. Felsky's ideas about how we become attuned to particular works are persuasive. She believes that evaluation is inescapable, but she herself is not interested in making distinctions between high and popular culture. I explain in the thesis that Felsky considers reading to be a way of escaping one's milieu and everything it stands for, and also a way of forging connections. "Only connect," exclaims one of the characters in Ian Forster's novel about human affections and human connections, Howard's End. Felsky's preferred way of reading resonates with Forster's phrase and provides a vocabulary with which to deal with the passions and the affects of reading. My own lived experience of feeling like an abandoned child, however inadvertently this came about, hovers over each rereading encounter with Fanny Price. My own memories continue to connect me with her story and with the quality of life that is lived within Mansfield Park. My experiences were less fraught than Fanny's, but once those memories were roused, they inevitably coloured the way I have read and continue to read and reimagine the deeper currents of Fanny's life at Mansfield Park. In the reading method that I advocate, such memories and feelings are acknowledged, welcomed, and incorporated into my appraisal of the narrative. And so to the novel Emma, the book of books that was published in 1816. This collage of screen images of Emma, the heroine whom Austen did not expect to be much liked by her readers, portrays visually the variety of ways in which film adaptations of the novel provide additional and alternative perspectives on the narrative, on the heroine, and on the themes. My personal favourite, and I really shudder to say that because most people don't agree, but my personal favourite was the 1996 film in which the actor Gwyneth Paltrow captured, to my best satisfaction, anyone else? Oh, good. Well, she captures, to my best satisfaction, the underlying vulnerability of the seemingly invincible mistress of Hartfield. So Emma became the final test case in the thesis, illustrating again an approach to reading that is deeply personal, that seriously notices the word on the page as well as the possibilities that lurk between the lines, and that is also respectful of and attentive to the critical reception to the text, as well as to the many contexts of the text. Now, the appraisal of Emma illustrates again the creative nature of reading responses that acknowledge deeply personal aspects of the reading experience. Here, I recall the physical conditions associated with my first reading of the novel, again from the thesis. The copy of Emma that sat alongside my notebook when I attended Thelma Herring's lectures at the University of Sydney in 1949 is the one I continue to read today. It has no introduction, and I now have at least 5 other editions, each with a thoughtful and useful introduction by an Austen scholar. But my original copy, which you see there with its hard covers, faded to just a blush of pink and a little frayed at the edges, is my everyday reader whenever I revisit Emma for sheer reading pleasure. The most significant marking on the first page, perhaps the most significant of the markings dotted throughout the small book, is a circle that I made with my pen around the word seemed in the opening sentence of Emma. Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever and rich, with a comfortable home and a happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years with very little to vex or distress her. The discussion continues. I imagine now, although memories have faded along with the book cover, that the circle and the little comment in the margin that reads subjunctive, comma, question mark, / doubt were made at a desktop in the lecture theatre as I put to use, first use, the deluxe fountain pen I had been given to celebrate my matriculation from high school. With this pen, I jotted down Thelma Herring's comments and observations in a large exercise book. I go on to recall how my interest in the idea of verbs in the subjunctive form was aroused by my own mother's pride as an immigrant in knowing the rules of English grammar. She reminded me always to use the subjunctive form of the verb to be after what she called ifing, wishing and doubting. And she had been taught to do that at a school she attended in Jerusalem, established to educate girls, very often poor girls like my mother, to a standard required for admission to Oxford. In the thesis, I elaborate on this idea. I must then have been prepared for Miss Herring's suggestion to consider that the use of the word seem was a signal of the subjunctive mood and a sign of the doubt and uncertainty would be central to my response to the novel. She read the sentence aloud twice, emphasising the word seemed only on the second reading. Suddenly the mood changed. The word seems, when highlighted, cast a shadow over the opening proposition and became a catalyst for questioning the reality of Emma's blessings, even a hint that attentive readers might find at the heart of the novel a series of questionable propositions. It seems to Emma that Harriet will be better off married to Mr. Elton, with whom she has nothing in common, than to Mr. Martin, with whom she has already formed a bond. It seems to Emma that Frank Churchill must be in love with her, and it seems to Emma that Jane Fairfax must be in love with Mr. Dixon. It is in this sense that Emma the novel unfolds for the first paragraph as a succession of beautifully integrated episodes, each of which turns out not to be what it first appears, and especially not to be how it appears to Emma. In the following passage from the thesis, I call on personal observations and remembered experiences, and taking serious of note of what is in the narrative, I blend them with the critical record. The subjunctive mood of the novel complements the raising of Emma's consciousness during passages of free direct discourse, a technique for exposing the inner consciousness of characters that Austen brings to perfection in this novel. As I have read the novel over the years, I have reflected on Emma's dawning self-awareness, coupled with the unalloyed pleasure offered by seemingly trivial events like dinners, dances, and parties. The secret lies in the profound insights that emerge almost imperceptibly for the reader from the nature of interactions between human beings in a social setting. That is when I recall the definition of modulation that my elocution teacher entered in my exercise book in her small, neat writing. Modulation, light and shade, the art of varying tone and mood. The blend of light and shade in Emma is perfectly achieved. The sparkle that emanates from Emma's life at Hartfield, the sparkle which the most recent film version creates so vividly, is modulated by the multitude of unrecognised flaws that critics have identified in the heroine's self-perception. Each narrative twist and turn of the novel is distinguished similarly. The analysis of Emma is also a test case for what I define in thesis speak as a multi-methodological reader response in which the traditionally critical is blended with the deeply personal. I focus on Emma's relationship with Mr. Knightley and return to the idea of the subjunctive in the following paragraph from the thesis. I noticed too Mr. Knightley's use of the subjunctive when rebuking Emma for her treatment of Miss Bates. Were she a woman of fortune? Were she your equal in situation? In this case, the subjunctive is also the empathetic. Emma is alerted to her past lack of judgment, to her woeful insensitivity to others. Attentive readers witness the subtle transition of the self-love that fuels Emma's sense of power and has led her into misunderstandings and wrong judgments as it becomes authentic self-knowledge. Her mind ceases to be a hiding place, as one of her critical readers called it, for her flawed notions about other people and about her own ability to read the minds of friends and acquaintances. Knowing at last that she loves her brother-in-law, she dares to take the boldest risk of her life, testing reality and testing Mr. Knightley too, urging him to speak, even while dreading what she might hear. His accustomed reticence produces a beautifully romantic understatement. If I loved you less, he tells her, I might be able to talk about it more. He in his turn learns something from Emma, to value rather than criticise her liveliness and charm, and together they acquire what the critic Lionel Trilling named so aptly, intelligent love, a quality that promises both wisdom and tenderness. The reading method that I practice in my thesis led to an invitation to write a reading memoir in which Austen's fiction is central to my reading life. The Jane Austen remedy demonstrates in different ways how this approach to reading brings us as readers face to face with the values and social capabilities that have been and will continue to be significant issues in our lives. It is a method of reading that encourages us to take notice of and often take pleasure in the unexpected resonances between the fiction we are reading and the life we have lived, the understandings and the misunderstandings we have encountered. It discourages abstractions and theoretical distractions, conditions to which Elie Wiesel, a Nobel Prize winner and Holocaust survivor, attributed the failure of education to teach young people to embrace humanistic values, an education which he speculates might have disposed a nation to recoil from the idea of participating in a national genocide. My own feminist consciousness prevails in the multi-stranded reading method that I demonstrate. This encouraged me to move beyond the education of Austen's heroines to a consideration of what a reading education is, of how we come to know what we think we know, of how and what we learn from others. When we respond to what we read, both creatively and critically, there are enhanced opportunities, I argue, to develop the skills as well as the ethical and social capabilities that we require to find and sustain our bearings in a complex and often perplexing network of values, institutions, and relationships. These, it seems to me, are good reasons for and good ways of learning how to read at school, or indeed at any age. And that is where, for better, richer, wiser reading, I rest my case. Thank you. You want to ask any questions?
Thank you, Ruth. That was absolutely fascinating. Yes, we do have time for questions, but I would like to take advantage of me being up here to ask the first question, of course, which is, I'm interested of the three novels you chose. I'm guessing because of the point of your the direction of your thesis, it's because they had the most resonance with your life.
That is absolutely right. Although, well, that is what I thought at the time, but I always feel when people ask you which is the best or which is your favourite novel, it's actually not the one you're reading at the time, it's the one you're thinking about at the time. And I guess I think they fitted best into the way I had, particularly Mansfield Park. That was really there was no way I was going to do without Mansfield Park or Pride and Prejudice. The rest, I would have liked to do Persuasion, but then I was able to do that in the book as well.
Any other yes?
Did you find that when you interviewed teachers that they approached Jane Austen in much the same way that you do in their teachings?
Well, now you've actually hit on the source of the problem I had with my thesis supervisor. I had not been in the classroom and I was not prepared to do, that was not the sort of research I wanted to do. I actually didn't speak to many teachers. I spoke perhaps casually. I record that in the reading memoir to one who spoke to me, and that really shocked me when I realised that young students were approaching Northanger Abbey primarily in the framework of Gothic literature, and I felt that was another reason I wanted to undertake this. But what I did, if I didn't interview teachers, I knew the outcomes required in the syllabus very well, and they were the outcomes that most teachers, irrespective of the way they love the novels, they read the novels, many of them just like me, that is actually not the way they teach the novels if they are to achieve the syllabus outcomes. And I mean, that was one of the reasons I wanted to do the research.
Any other questions?
Sorry,
to
yes.
To repeat the question, for
yes.
teachers to teach in the way you're advocating, how would they evaluate students' answers for marking?
What I would advocate is really very much what I have done in my own reading memoir. Write as you are reading, and a constant ongoing journaling of what you're reading, the research you're doing, so that your reading and your writing become almost complementary. And I think that in that way, writing is another way of discovering yourself, I feel, if you're allowed to think about yourself. I think the biggest challenge for teachers using this method would be to ensure that with all the emphasis on the role of the reader in making reading, they still have to respect the text that is on the page. And I think that, I haven't done it, but I think it could be done.
Yes. Just to repeat the question, summarised. As you were doing your research, how did your past experience as a teacher make you reflect on what you were researching? Is that an adequate summary?
I think that what it made me realise was we were much freer to take that personal, what is the pleasure about, where does the pleasure come from, that sort of the emphasis on the pleasure. What we did not do, and I think it is still quite possible to do, is to introduce students at that, particularly at that year 11 and 12 stage, to more literary ideas, more ideas about where literature stands in the public discourse. I think they are ready for that. And what I've tried to do in the way I've written is weave those together to show how it could be done. But I have not been inside a classroom for many years, so I really don't know.
Any other questions? Yes, one up the back. Okay. Well, that wasn't a question, and no. I really hope Cheryl managed to catch some of it, but I will try to summarise the brief points, which were, from the point of view of a teacher, it's a delicate balance to prepare students to achieve best results in their final examination with engendering pleasure and enjoyment in the text and a love of reading, but she believes that if they do have that love of reading, love of literature, engagement with the text, that then can feed back into their final exam results.
Quite agree.
Okay. Over there. This question was, have there been any other authors aside from Jane Austen who have been continuously on the HSC list since 1911?
Only Shakespeare. Yeah, only Shakespeare. In the New South Wales list, yes.
Yes. The question was, in this day and age, could Austen be introduced to high school students earlier than years 11 and 12, drawing on your experience of exposure through the movie at 15?
I think they often are, and very well done. I've read some research and an account of a classroom project in which a teacher introduced her students to Pride and Prejudice, and they actually used social media as a way, and they ended up in actually adopting the language itself. I think if they were introduced, as they used to be when I was even in years 8 or 9, mainly for the story and the characters, not the more sophisticated literary aspect, it would make a lovely grounding for a deeper study later on.
Oh, yes. I think we better make this the last one. The question was, starting at that young age, how often should we reread Jane Austen? I think monthly, well, certainly annually, but...
Well, I have to tell you, as a child, I just remember, I always say there are readers and rereaders. Readers, when they're quite small, their parents read to them and they come to the end of the book, they say, more, another one. But rereaders say, start again, read it again. I remember when I finished Alice in Wonderland, just tipping it over the other way and starting again. I really think it's never... I mean, to me, any book that's worth reading once is worth rereading. So I just think, I mean, children do read the same books over and over again, don't they? And I mean, part of it's the repetition and part of it is the fresh perspective. And I think both of those can be balanced.
Can I just add to that, and I'm sorry to be preempting you, but in your spirit of resonance, I'd just like to share a story of my mother's, which is she frequently now rereads books like Jane Austen backwards, in that she'll pull it off the shelf to check for something, find the bit she was looking for, read on to the end, and then go back to the beginning and read up to where she was.
Inexhaustible possibilities.
Again, in case the microphone didn't pick it up, Susanna Fullerton said she read it when she was 10 with her mother, and that started off her lifelong love of Jane Austen. And I think with that, I'd like to call Cheryl to come and thank Ruth for talking with us.
Ruth, wasn't that interesting? The lady over here preempted something I wanted to mention, is that I've heard you speak about the value of rereading and the importance you get from a lifetime of rereading and relearning, and you have just loved Jane Austen forever, and it shows through in your deep knowledge and your enthusiasm for the rereading and the teaching of it. I first met you 7 years ago. I remember so well when Susanna introduced us. I was asked to go and visit a lady called Ruth who needed a little bit of a support for some mature age study she was doing. And
technology.
Yes, I'm a computer teacher, and she just wanted a little bit of support on being able to present her PowerPoint and your work confidently. And look at where this has got you. So I want to say thank you, Ruth. And it's been a very interesting talk today, and congratulations from all of us here and from me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.